Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Gavin Cleespies. I'm the Director of Programs, Exhibitions, and Community Partnerships for the Massachusetts Historical Society. I'm also not used to a podium facing in this direction, so you'll have to forgive me if I look slightly confused. It's nice to see such a full house, and it's always a pleasure to see a mixture of longtime supporters and some new friends. I'd like to extend a special welcome to any of our overseers who may have chosen to stay after their meeting, and also to anyone who is visiting MHS for the first time. If you are new to MHS, we are an independent nonprofit organization that is supported by its members and donors. We hold an incredible collection of family papers, personal letters, and organizational records, totaling somewhere close to 14 million manuscript pages. We make all this available to the public through our research room, which is free and open to the public, as well as through programs for academics, programs for educators, and of course public programs like tonight's. If you enjoyed tonight's program but are not yet a member, I hope you'll consider joining or supporting MHS. Tonight we're in for a great program. Nancy Seasholes will tell us about her amazing new publication, the Atlas of Boston History. This publication has been eagerly expected for a number of years and has been a great team project using the talent of many of MHS's friends. In total, the work represents the contributions of over 30 different authors who are the who's who of Boston historians. Tonight we'll hear from Nancy, the captain of the team, and 3 of the contributors. To give you a sense of the format of the program, I will give a very brief introduction and then turn the mic over to Nancy, who will talk for about 20 minutes about the Atlas. We will then hear from three of our contributors who will highlight parts of the Atlas that they are particularly fond of. And finally, we'll open up to a few questions from the audience. We're also, of course, aware that not everyone has had dinner, so we'll try to wrap everything up by 7 or 7:15. And if you don't have a chance to ask a question during the Q&A session, I just want to let you know that everyone will be in the lobby with the book signing, and so if you have another question, you can ask it at that point. So speaking tonight, we'll hear from Nancy Seasholes, Bob Allison, Robert Allison, Richard Garver, and Jim Vrabel. Nancy Seasholes is a historian and historical archaeologist who works as an independent scholar. Much of her research has focused on the history of Boston, particularly in the process of landmaking that gradually allowed the city to grow through the filling of thousands of acres of tidal flats. Her previous publications include the highly acclaimed Gaining Ground, A History of Landmaking in Boston, and Walking Tours of Boston's Made Land. Next up, and this is going in reverse order on the stage, we have Robert Allison. He is a professor of history at Suffolk University. He received his PhD from Harvard and has published numerous books on the history of Boston. He is the president of the South Boston Historical Society. He is also the president of Revolution 250 and has been involved with many historical organizations across Metro Boston. Richard Garver was the deputy director for transportation and infrastructure at the Boston Redevelopment Authority for 36 years. Among his many accomplishments in that role is the creation of the Boston Public Market. He is active in a number of nonprofits and, like me, also holds a master's degree from the University of Chicago. Jim Vrabel is a Boston historian with a strong interest in community activism. He is author of A People's History of the New Boston and When in Boston, A Timeline and Almanac. He is also an active chronicler of Boston history, maintaining a Boston history database that includes tens of thousands of entries on significant events, buildings, and changes to the environment. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panel and speaker.
So, we're here tonight, as you know, to talk about a new book about Boston history, the Atlas of Boston History, an historical atlas of Boston. Before I say something about the atlas, however, I want to say something about this bird's eye that's on the cover. The University of Chicago Press that published the atlas wanted to use a bird's eye on the cover, but I said all color bird's eyes of Boston have already been used as book covers. So we were at something of an impasse until someone who is much better at searching the online catalog of the Leventhal Map Center at the BPL found this bird's eye, which was new to me and I hope is new to many people. It was published in 1866 in Germany. It's titled Ansicht von Boston, View of Boston, Achternate aufgenommen, taken from nature. This bird's eye appeared in a German magazine called Die Gartenlaube, the Garden Pavilion, and was apparently acquired in 2004 by the Leventhal Map Center, but then lay uncatalogued for many years until their cataloger recently found it, cataloged it, and used it in a 2018 exhibit that the Leventhal Center mounted entitled Mapping Boston's Green Spaces. So it seemed to be a solution to our problem. And as you can see, the atlas cover is a detail from the bird's eye. So now, more about the atlas itself. It is, as I said, an historical atlas of Boston, meaning that it traces Boston's history from the earliest days to the present through maps. Some historical atlases use historical maps. This atlas uses basically maps that were drafted for it, especially by a team of cartographers. The Atlas project was really my idea. Even when we were working on mapping Boston 20 years ago, I kept saying, what Boston needs is an historical atlas. And then when I was working on my book, Gaining Ground, about all the land making in Boston, I kept wishing that there were one book in which I could find maps of, say, the water system, or the sewerage system, or the railroads, or even all the population figures for Boston. So as soon as I finished my last book, the Walking Tours book, I called a meeting of Boston historians who write on Boston history to ask if they would be interested in working on an historical atlas. They were, and this formed the steering committee for the atlas, some of whose members are here tonight, obviously. We met for between 2007 and 2010, trying to hammer out the contents of the atlas. Once we had done that, then we started the mapping process. So, as you know, in an atlas, the maps are generally arranged in double-page spreads called plates. This is the first plate in the atlas. The atlas has 11 sections, which I'm not sure you can read it, but their titles are down in the lower corners, that trace Boston's history chronologically, because what we wanted to do was to tell the story of Boston's development from the earliest times to the present. So the very first plate talks about the Boston area during the last ice age. The map shows that the Boston Basin was in a geological formation. Shows the Boston Basin was in a geological formation called the Boston Basin. The northern part was the Boston Basin, which was filled with a glacier during the last ice age. This is a photo of the Boston Basin taken from Belmont Hill, which shows the depth of that glacier in comparison with the present buildings. This is the Hancock Building and the Prue, and this is 4,000 feet of ice that covered the whole area. The map also shows that at the bottom of the Boston Basin, there were two different types of bedrock. In the northern part, a sedimentary rock, a shale, called Cambridge argillite. Now I'm pointing to the column on the right-hand side of the page. And in the southern part, I'm back on the map on the page. And in the southern part, I'm back on the map on the left. A conglomerate, that's a rock composed of stones embedded in a matrix called Roxbury conglomerate, or the early settlers called it Roxbury pudding stone because they thought these stones looked like the plums in plum pudding. There are actually two types of Roxbury pudding stone. A light-colored type with small stones, of which there are many churches in Back Bay and the South End. And then now the lower right-hand corner, a darker colored type with larger stones that Frederick Law Olmsted used for many of the structures in the parks he built. These are the stairs in Doherty Park in Charlestown. The next section is about Boston in the 1630s. We have a plate on the founding of Boston, map on the left-hand side. The map shows the counties in England from which early residents of Boston came. And the map on the right-hand side is actually a real coup. This shows the town boundaries of the towns in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1640, overlaid on a modern map showing the towns that were set off from them. This is the first and only map like this, and it took a lot of research. The next section is about Boston in the 1700s. It does have an historical map. I said there weren't many, but there are a few. And in this case, in case you're having trouble relating the map to the present shoreline, to the present map of Boston, we provide a locator map, the map at the top of the left-hand page. All of our maps, this is the first of many plates in Boston in a specific year. The plates about Boston in a specific year generally include a population graph. Now, the graph in the middle of the left-hand page, a population graph showing Boston's population in relation to the major towns or cities, as they became, in America. In this case, Boston is shown in black, and though I know you can't read the dates, basically it was the most populous town in the colonies until about 1750, when it was overtaken first by Philadelphia and then by New York. These plates about Boston in a specific year often include an architectural sidebar about the most important architectural, or the dominant style of architecture at the time, in this case, Georgian architecture. We generally illustrate them with the public building. This is the old State House, the one on the left, which may not look to you like the old State House today, and that's because you have to remember the date of this plate is 1743. As you probably know, the old State House burned in 1747, 48, and was rebuilt. So this is the way it looked before the fire, without the lion and the unicorn. An upper middle class house is the Shirley Eustace House in Roxbury, and then a middle class house is the Clough House in the North End, which again did not look like this, does not look like this today. This is the way it looked in 1743, and a floor plan to show how people lived in these houses at the time. The map itself shows where people lived. In red, it shows the churches, the schools. Yellow is the public buildings, and industries were generally located around the waterfront. It so happens there's a 1743 view of Boston where we've numbered all of the features and then numbered those same features on the map where they're labeled so that you can compare the two. The next section is about Boston from the Revolution to 1828 and includes this plate by Dick Garver on the economy. We have a number of plates on the economy of Boston because what we were trying to do was to show what drove Boston's development over all these years, and we felt a lot of it was economically driven. So the map here shows not only the China trade, which developed during this time, but as Dick points out in his discussion, the trade with Europe, which was really the more important trade at the time. The next section we titled The Athens of America. It covers primarily Boston as a cultural leader in the early 1800s. This plate by Susan Wilson, who is here, covers Boston as a literary center. It has sites, important literary sites in Boston. I'm on the left-hand page. Cambridge, now I'm on the right-hand page, and Concord. And now I'm in the column on the far right-hand page. And all of these 54 other sites have equal paragraphs written about them that wouldn't fit on the plate, so it's at the back of the book. The next section is basically about Boston in the middle of the 19th century, and includes this plate on the economy, on which Dick worked again. It shows that there were a number of industries in Boston. Piano making was important at this time, but it was still located in the downtown area and was just beginning to move to the South End, where, as you know, it became a very important industry in the later 19th century. Other important industries in Boston were leatherworking and upholstery, soap making in Cambridge, various other industries in Charlestown, East Boston, South Boston, and Roxbury, including quarrying. This map shows the leather dealers tended to be located along very specific streets. This is the Central Business District. Banks along State Street, and the high-end retail stores were located along Washington Street and Hanover Street. The map is a good example of an important feature of the atlas, and that is that we tried to make all the shoreline of all the maps historically accurate for the date of the map, in this case 1855. So this is not the 1855 shoreline of Boston. This is the 1855 shoreline of Boston in dark green, shown on the lighter green, which is the present shoreline. The difference between the two, of course, is all the land making that's taken place since. So we were always looking for maps to give to the cartographers so that they could recreate these historical shorelines accurately. And in this case, we relied heavily on this 1852 map of Boston by Henry McIntyre. Not only is the Boston Peninsula quite accurate, but so are, it also shows Cambridge, Charlestown, East Boston, South Boston, and Roxbury, which we knew we wanted to include on our map. The next section we entitled Metropolitan Boston. It really has to do with the expansion of the Boston Peninsula, or the smaller Boston Peninsula outward, the annexation era. And this is the first of a number of plates that we have on the development of the public transportation system. This one showing the horse car lines that existed after 1856. Horse cars, as you know, were streetcars that ran on steel tracks but pulled by horses, and even though just horse-powered, one of these lines was quite extensive, went all the way to the Lynn. And then, now the map next to it, the great expansion of that system once it was electrified, beginning in 1888. The map on the right-hand side of the page shows the early development of the present subway system. As you probably know, the very first subway in the whole Western Hemisphere was in Boston. It opened in 1897 and ran between Park Street and the Public Garden. It was the forerunner of today's Green Line. It was what we call a streetcar subway. They were streetcars that ran underground. The next line that opened was an elevated train line that ran on Washington Street through the South End, Atlantic Avenue around the waterfront, and Main Street in Charlestown. The third line to open was another streetcar subway, which ran the forerunner of today's Blue Line, which ran from Bowdoin Square to Maverick Square in East Boston through a tunnel under the harbor that was the second longest vehicle tunnel in North America at the time. This wasn't converted to the present rapid transit train system until 1924, and then the last system to be developed was the forerunner of today's Red Line. The next section we call Boston in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Now, we tried to avoid the term century in the atlas. You know, it's very confusing to people. You talk about the 17th century, but you really mean the 1600s. So we tried to stick to hundreds, but sometimes it ended up in awkwardnesses such as this. In any case, this plate shows the movement of cultural institutions such as museums, libraries, and historical societies from the downtown area in the late 1700s excuse me, to the Common in the early 1800s, Back Bay after it was filled in the later 1800s, and then eventually to the Fenway area at the beginning of the 1900s. And the MHS is a perfect example of this. It started here on Tremont Street in the 1790s, then moved to the attic of Faneuil Hall, then to the Tontine Crescent, then to the Provident Bank building back on Tremont Street, where it stayed for most of the 19th century. A brief return to the Tremont Street down here, and then, skipping the whole Back Bay thing, moved to the Fenway in 1899. 7 moves. Then we have a section that we call the decline. Boston had a very long period of depression that lasted from 1920 to 1960, much longer than the National Depression, which, as you know, didn't begin until 1929 and ended in the 1930s, or some people feel not until World War II, but certainly did not last until 1960. During that time, the public housing in Boston developed. This plate was done by Larry Vrabel at MIT, who's the big authority on public housing. He's actually speaking here in a panel next week on subsidized housing. And Larry feels that this map is the first of its kind. It shows all the public housing projects in Boston. The family housing projects, beginning with the Mary Ellen McCormick and the Old Colony, that the Boston Housing Authority built until 1954. Then they moved to housing for the elderly, and now it's mostly voucher housing, which is shown in the purple. These graphs show the black line is the change in all of the public housing projects from white to non-white, and the graphs show different projects and how quickly they themselves changed. And the maps down here show the location of the almshouse in Boston, which the public way of dealing with the poor, which I can only say was dealt with in an out of sight, out of mind approach. It was always located on the fringes or outside the settled areas of Boston. Then we have a section on the revival, which includes a plate on the busing crisis by Jim, who is kindly not sitting on the stage. The map shows all the schools in black. The colors show the census districts, which have over 50% of a particular race, green being white, orange, yellow, African American, and magenta, purple, Chinese. So you can see with I'm talking about the map on the left, so that you can see with all the African Americans concentrated in Roxbury, Dorchester, and on Columbia Point, and the Chinese in the Chinatown area, how difficult it was to come up with a plan that would integrate all the schools in Boston. The photo on the right is protests outside Hyde Park High School. And then, finally, we have a final section of which one plate is about environmental problems. This is the problem of approaching sea level rise, the red and orange showing areas that would be flooded given different degrees of sea level rise, on which we put the original shoreline of Boston because, as you'll note, the areas that would be most likely to flood are areas of made land. The other problems we illustrate are other problems caused by the made land in Boston, the falling groundwater, rotting foundation piles, and Boston's susceptibility to damage in case of earthquakes. So that gives you a little idea of what's in the atlas, and now I know my colleagues would like to say something.
Well, thank you, Nancy. And this is one of those books, now that it exists, people will wonder why it didn't before. And Nancy's actually just given you the tip of the iceberg of what is in it. And I think one reason it didn't exist before is it's impossible to do a book like this.
Tell me about it.
In fact, you know, I was happy to be on the advisory committee, about 15 years ago, and then I started dodging Nancy for about 5 or 6 years.
He's not the only one.
Yeah. And so every name you see on the list of contributors, just imagine, that's about a dozen or more entreaties from Nancy to do something. And she is persistent, as you know. I don't want you now to be discouraged if she does contact you, because it's an extraordinary thing to take. It's not quite safe to say that anyone who's written a book on Boston in the last 30 years is somehow involved in this one. She found people there who are very busy doing things and persuaded them that they should be part of this. She mentioned, of course, my esteemed colleagues here, but also Bob Anderson, who's one of the foremost authorities on the Puritan migration, did the map of where people came from. And Susan Wilson, who is here, did Women in Boston as well as Culture in Boston. She created the Boston Women's History Trail, and Carl Hageland wrote the book on the creation of the Charles River, and he contributed to this. And other people, if I started naming names, will be here for the rest of the night just listening. But it's really extraordinary that you're able to pull these people together. So I know there are some folks who were left out either because they managed to block you, And then others who you just didn't find in time. But it's also safe to say that probably for the next 100 years, this is going to be the resource for people who want to know Boston. And not only, and we who are Boston historians know that if you know Boston, you know America, if not the world. And so this is really the starting point. It's a tremendous resource that, as you see, has everything: the economy, theaters, ironworks, sewage system, piano factories, the water system, the tea. Not only is this going to be a resource for scholars, it's going to be a resource. I think every desk at the now BPDA should have it, the mayor should have it, members of the city council should have it, because this explains Boston. And so it will do this for the next half century, century or more. I'm now beginning to worry what Nancy's next project is. Good. Well deserved. But it's also going to allow us to ask new questions and come up with new answers, and we hope will bring new generations of Boston scholars to be able to probe the city's history and continue digging into it. So I really thank Nancy for seeing this through.
And I thank all my colleagues who put up with me. Yes, I was a nag. But they put up with me, and they came through in the end, and we got it finished. And I must say, it is a beautiful job. As one author who's here, Carl, commented tonight, it looked good on the screen, on our screens, but it really looks good printed in paper. So I hope you enjoy it.
The task here is to allow you all to ask questions, but to give you a glimpse, at least, of the kind of things that you will find in here, just to whet your appetite. One of the approaches that I took is, wherever possible, finding a who knew dimension to a story. Railroads development in Boston are interesting in that respect to me, because did you know that Boston was a center of railroading in 1850? There was more railroads, 7 coming into Boston, and more miles, 3,000, connecting Boston to its hinterland and beyond than any other city in the United States. So the question then would be why? And this plate is a glimpse of why. It's because Boston region's economy, and particularly its industrial economy, developed differently than any other in the United States. In Mid-Atlantic, New York City, the Philadelphia area, they were concentrations of industry, largely serving a prosperous agricultural hinterland. Boston's hinterland wasn't particularly prosperous, and therefore any number of people began to develop in 2 streams of industry, textiles and shoes. And that's what, if you can see up there, the blue is textiles by dollar value of output from the 1855 Massachusetts Industrial Census, and the red, or whatever that color is shoes. And it couldn't happen, of course, on its own, because a lot of these were small-time proprietors. They couldn't afford to develop their own sourcing of raw materials and so on. So Boston was the exchange. So hence, all these cities, as they sought prosperity, wanted to be connected to Boston by this hot new mode of transportation, railroads, which was initially envisioned as drawn by horses, but then came steam. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to leave it at that. And just for the diversity, let's do the, this is one I particularly enjoyed putting together. It's this period of time, 1895 to 1903, happens to be a real transition point in the participation and attention to sports in Boston. The who knew dimension here is to take an example. Through the 1880s, rowing was probably the biggest sport with the biggest following in the city, and the rowers were Irish. I hear some sports at that period of time were club-based anyway, so if you're thinking, what about Harvard? Well, Harvard had rowing. It likes to claim to have the first intercollegiate athletic event in 1852, Harvard versus Yale. The story is actually more interesting. A real estate developer in Lake Winnipesaukee has had a son who rowed in for the junior class. It was a club-based organization, the junior class in Yale. And he said, what if I got the junior class boat from Yale to row against the junior class boat from Harvard on the lake? And everybody would come up on the train to see that, and then they'd buy my property. And that's the start of collegiate athletics, and it's never really lost its money dimension. So the sports were organized on a club basis, as I say. There were, at one time or another, about 17 different rowing clubs in Boston. Many of them are noted here that still existed at that time. With exception of Union, they were all Irish. You look at the presidents of those clubs, the names are all Irish. And they were neighborhoods competing against each other, and they had tremendous followings. The city of Boston put on an annual regatta where they raised money and gave it to the competitors. And it drew 30,000 people to the basin each year. So all of a sudden we get big changes. I know we're pushing the time here. So I'll try to be quick. We get big changes in the 1880s. There was an amateur movement. Longwood Cricket Club was part of that with the founding of Lawn Tennis Association. Rowing the pros got separated from the amateurs. And as it happened, the participation in the class structure of Boston broadened enormously. Boston was inundated with people involved in sports. And what had been special purpose clubs like rowing clubs became multi-purpose clubs like the BAA, which as I recall is 1897. And it offered, we think of it, well, that's people who run the marathon. You can see their clubhouse up there, the big building, which unfortunately burned, but it had bowling, it had swimming, it had all kinds of stuff in there. And the reason the finish line is where it is because it's adjacent to that building. So we had another interesting dimension. Sports were so pervasive that religious denominations, to compete for male parishioners, felt they had to offer sports. And I'll cite as an example the Mission Church, a particular segment of the Catholic Church, built something comparable to that in Roxbury called the St. Alphonsus Association. And they also built a boathouse because if you weren't rowing, you weren't in Boston sports. I could go on because you'll find, this is a teaser. You'll find some interesting stuff. One other who knew, golf became really big all of a sudden at this point in time. So that the country club, that wasn't a golf club. That was a place for people to go riding. But golf became so big, they turned it into a golf course. And really, who knew, right where Old Braves Field, now Nickerson Field is, that was the Allston Golf Club. So, and you'll see the location on the map there. So let me pass it over to
Thank you. I decided to try and tackle the busing issue in the Atlas. In the early months of the recent Democratic presidential nomination campaign, busing became an issue, and it should have been no surprise to anybody in Boston that it is still a sensitive topic to talk about. Senator Kamala Harris accused former Vice President Joe Biden of being against busing. Biden stumbled somewhat in his reply. I wish Biden had said, and I wish the people of Boston had maintained back then and now, that you can be against a specific busing plan and still be for the desegregation of schools. Similarly, you can be against Medicare for all and still be for health care for all. Busing, like health care, like urban renewal, like any of these other plans, is a public policy issue. And it's very important to get the details right. And what I tried to do in the Atlas with the busing plate was to try and explain those details and try and explain how you might be for or against a particular plan. And that did not necessarily brand you as against desegregation or for segregation of schools. As Nancy already alluded to, the map shows the concentration of the minority population in Boston at the time, packed into the central city with the outlying they're not suburbs, but the outlying neighborhoods, which were almost all 95 to 99% white. So that's the challenge that was faced by the court. The dots show the schools, the 125 or so schools, and the lines show the district lines that were used for the eventual plan that was implemented, which is called Phase 2. In the text, I try to explain how Judge Garrity's decision in 1944 couldn't really be argued with. I'm sorry, 1974. Couldn't be argued with. To paraphrase, but almost quote, the Boston School Committee had intentionally segregated the schools by using policies that included busing and that were antithetical to the neighborhood school system. So the decision was incontrovertible. The remedy, then, the plan, is not, can be argued with, and that's what a lot of the arguments that followed were all about. Originally, I was going to try to show an alternate plan that had been proposed, the so-called master's plan or the McCormick plan. But it was difficult to show on the map, or I couldn't figure out how to show it because it looked very similar on paper. Same districts, same schools, similar districts, same schools. The key difference between the master's plan and the eventual Phase 2 was the master's plan required every school to reflect the racial percentages in the district that it was in, whereas in the Phase 2 plan, every school had to reflect the racial percentages of the city as a whole. So when you look at the map, you see how difficult that was. In the master's plan, students would be bused to schools, not nearest their homes, but nearer their homes. But to reach that, what they call the ideal racial percentage, students had to be bused much farther away. So you see what a difficult plan, how difficult it would be to implement that policy. We'll never know what would have happened if the master's plan had been adopted. It received at the time broad, if not deep, support. But we do know what happened when the Phase 2 plan was adopted, and the opposition and the heartache and the violence that followed, the damage to the schools and the neighborhoods in the city. And I just wanted to show how difficult it was to come up with a plan and suggest the possibilities that working harder to come up with a better plan might have avoided all the heartache and the guilt and everything else that followed. Next one. This is Boston in 1950, the so-called Old Boston. And by various means, a map that shows the racial breakdown of the city, charts and graphs that show the demographics, the jobs that were held by people. It shows a much different city than we have today. I want to compare that now to flashing ahead to 2010, Boston of today. This is similar in that it has a detailed map that shows the racial breakdown of the city and also shows how much different that is than the racial breakdown, the geographic racial breakdown that we saw in the 1970s. And it has texts and charts and graphs that show the population, the demographics, job numbers, how things have changed. But this plate contains my favorite graphic in the whole atlas. And I might ask Bob Allison to get out of the way so that I can...
It's this one.
Turn about being fair play.
What we have to say for the people who can't see the laser pointer. The graph in the lower right-hand corner of the right-hand side.
Okay? So it's this
Not
graph.
the laser pointer to talk to.
No, that's all right. That's the graph. That's my favorite graph. And it employs something called the location quotient. It takes some getting used to. My former colleague at the former Boston Redevelopment Authority, John Avalt, who is responsible for the plate, is also responsible for this graphic, and I think it's terrific. The dotted line, and I'm sure it's a blur to most of you, but there's a straight dotted line down the middle, and that shows household income distribution across the United States. 13% could have a household income of $15,000, 25% could have an income of $80,000. Doesn't matter what it is. When you're using it as a location quotient, it's a straight line with a value of 1.0. This is a little bit of heavy lifting, but it's worth it. The blue line, which almost looks like a smile, shows the distribution in Boston. And what it shows is that Boston has, in 2010, most recently, a 50% higher breakdown of poor people than the nation as a whole, a 50% higher incidence of well-off households than the nation as a whole, and it has a 25% lower percentage of households that are working class or that are middle class. To me, this is a very powerful graphic. I wish John had employed it in the 1950 plate. If he had, and I've seen it because he did these things 10 years ago, it would have shown a blue line that it's almost like a frown, but it would have showed that Boston had a 25% lower percentage of poor households than the nation, a 25% lower percentage of well-off people than the nation, but a higher percentage of the working class. So it goes from a frown to a smile.
In other words, he's saying for the 1950 it would have been.
The 1950 would have been a frown more than a smile. But for this 2010 graphic, to me, it's the most powerful demonstration of Boston today. A picture is worth 1,000 words. For all the words that we can spend decrying the housing crisis and the gentrification in Boston and the change in neighborhoods and the closure of places like Doyle's, this one graphic to me shows what the city has become and how different it is from the old Boston. It has really flipped from a city of the working class to a city of the haves and the have-nots. And that to me is, these graphics are loaded throughout the atlas, and they are worth the time. And sometimes you have to spend some time going over them and figuring out what they say, but it is worth the effort, because that to me is the strength of the atlas that it teaches us more and makes us understand more about Boston than we did before.
Yeah, why not go to 1912 on the sports plate to get the founding of the Red Sox, or the Fenway Park, I'm sorry. I guess the main story to me was the founding of the Red Sox. And that's a fascinating story because, of course, what became the Braves were here since 1871, if I recall right. At least the creating of the South End grounds where they played. Baseball at that time was an entrepreneurial activity, promoters pulling together a pretty rough ragtag group of individuals. It was rowdy, and its popularity was based on betting. If you can imagine going to Fenway Park and there are people circulating not to sell you beer, but to take your bet on what that batter's going to do right now, or who's going to win, whatever you can bet on in baseball has infinite things to bet on. That's what's going on. The American League was founded in part in reaction to that. Actually, the South End grounds burned down in a fan riot over some offenses by the Baltimore Orioles. And it burned down a great stretch of Lower Roxbury in doing it. So the American League in some ways was considered to be more of a civilized league, and one of the original teams, I believe it was one of the original teams, was the Red Sox. And then lo and behold, they were in the first World Series on that date. And that's, to me, that was the story. Yep.
Great, thank you. First, thank you for the work that you've done, and all of you, and especially Nancy, in bringing you all together, some willingly. I found a lot of this fascinating. I can't wait to get a hold of the book and go through it and spend time with the graphs and the maps. And what resonated, one of the many things that resonated, was the map around public housing. I grew up in Mission Hill Extension projects. My career has been spent dealing with housing issues, not just in Boston, but nationally. But it also made me think about probably one of the most famous or infamous maps that we could look at in terms of Boston is the Federal Housing Administration map of the 1930s that originated the concept of redlining, where neighborhoods were redlined. And what's fascinating is you take the school busing map and do an overlay with the 1935 FHA map of undesirable neighborhoods, they would be pretty much the same. So the legacy of housing discrimination, in this sense by government agencies, that was carried on by financial institutions right through the 60s and 70s and arguably through the 90s. And please, this is not a criticism. I just cherish the work that you've done. But I think kind of in volume 2, I hope you get. Oh yeah, there has to be a volume 2. You guys are not leaving after tonight. But I think showing that FHA map, then, and I'll close with the BBERG, the Boston Bank Urban Renewal Group map of the 70s, which flipped FHA. African Americans were only able to get FHA mortgages within the concentrated neighborhoods that you already showed. And so that has a great deal to do with the shaping of Boston, and I hope that someday we get to that point as well.
I was going to say essentially what you just said. It's an interesting question. In which cases the mapping was confined to Boston proper, and in which cases it needed to tell a story to go outside. And Jim O'Connell, who's here, did a terrific plate on the development of the suburbs. And I'm just thinking as you're talking, if you laid the federal housing insurance criteria over not just Boston, but the suburbs, you would find explicitly you can't insure houses in places like Roxbury. And there's a gradation of criteria of desirable financing, and it goes to the suburbs. And it has a
Exactly.
lot to do with the story.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks. Yes.
Here, have a mic. No, mic.
Okay, we'll share this.
I was struck by the fact that I think you said the Depression in Boston ended in the 60s. And then your map would imply that the working class was better in Boston prior to the 60s. And for some reason I'm having trouble with that, like an explanation.
Yeah, I'll just speculate. They were still living in Boston. They might not have been working. The jobs left starting in the 20s, which Dick shows in his plate, the manufacturing jobs that went south or went internationally. But they were still in Boston. They were still finding work, the people in Boston. It was still primarily a working class city, but those jobs were leaving. So I would think it's a statistical anomaly in some ways that the jobs were gone, but the workers were still there, and they were working any place they could and continued to be working class.
They were doing better than the national.
Not necessarily, again, that's where this location quotient you have to look at. It's not that they were making more money, but they were more working class people in Boston than there were in the United States as a whole. So they were holding on, but they might not have been doing well.
And I don't have a slide to show you tonight, but our slide, we have a whole plate on the Long Depression, and it shows that although sectors increased jobs in Massachusetts, those very same sectors lost jobs in Boston during those years.
I had a question, and Dick, hi, and Jim, hi. I've watched you, obviously, over the years. No, my boss and mentor. About the process, we talked a lot as we've stayed in touch about your process. I was curious, Jim, you mentioned working with John Avalder, talking or observing his studies, and then Dick, you collaborated with folks on specific plates, but something like the river, did you talk to Carl about the basin, even though you're obviously familiar with it? How much did you cross, or did you suggest, Nancy, not to do too much of that lest you get pulled away from your task? I'm just curious really about that work.
The question, I'm sorry, could you, so the question is, how much did I suggest that authors communicate with each other?
Right.
How much did I suggest, or how much did I tell other authors they were,
Precisely that. If Dick was co-editing one particular plate, other peers working on something else might have something to add, but I'd be concerned, get pulled in a different direction, and how did you manage that? It's really about the collaboration piece and how hard or how easy it might have been.
okay. I
Thanks.
think I understand the question. The question.
Let me jump in and say,
No, here, try this one.
I think Nancy approved of us roping in as many people as we could, as often as we could, so that she didn't have to do it. Is that?
And I was about to say that I was always grateful when I got an author working on their own plate. And no, I did not suggest a lot of distractions. I'd really tried to work with that author on that plate. Somebody asked, I spoke to another group last night, somebody asked, how did we do it? Well, the steering committee wrote brief descriptions of each one of the plates that they wanted in the atlas. When we found, the steering committee themselves took out a lot of the plates. When we found other authors, I would send them that description. I would generally suggest that they write what we call the text part of the plate. Each plate has about 400 words here that covers the basic concepts in the plate, what they thought was important. I suggest that they write that first, generally as a guide to what they thought should be in the plate. Then the author was responsible for coming up with whatever photos they wanted or the data on which the graphs were going to be made. The graphs were, however, all made, and the maps, by the cartographers. But the data were, all of this was then sent to the cartographers, who sent back a draft of the plate, and then we would go back, a lot of back and forth between the author, the cartographer, and me, correcting it. Many too many drafts as far as the cartographers were concerned. But in any case, until we came up with the final plate. But to answer your question, no, unless people were already working together, I did not suggest authors working with each other on a particular plate.
Peter, it's a thought-provoking question. I'm the only non-professional historian in the lot. But this threw me in contact with professional historians, and I have the impression that it's the nature of their profession to work. I'm looking for a better word than in isolation. I mean, they spend so much time in the library and in the archives. It's an activity that is inherently single person. But when you get to the more contemporary part of this story, it became a little different because we had this wealth of people who were doing researches on specific angles of modern Boston. And I'm so glad you mentioned John Avalt, because I had the best time collaborating with John. He is such a smart son of a gun. And he contributed so much, and I don't think he's here tonight, so it's too bad, because he deserves a lot of credit.
No offense. It's best for society that we